You're listening to a series on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. Most of the information in this series is drawn from Dr. Dale Allison's The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, History. You can find links to other episodes in this series, as well as his fantastic book, in the description. Last episode, we covered the earliest creedal statements about Jesus' death and resurrection. Here's our portrait of the historical Jesus so far. Jesus was born around 4 BC. He grew up around Nazareth in Galilee. He spoke some Aramaic, some Hebrew, and maybe a little Greek. He began his ministry around 28 AD, calling people to repent like John the Baptist did. He announced the kingdom of Israel's God through parables, and he traveled around villages of Galilee, performing what people considered to be healings and exorcisms. He hung out with a diverse socioeconomic group and had a close relationship with 12 of his disciples. He came into conflict with Jewish authorities, particularly when he engaged in a dramatic action in the Temple of Jerusalem. Because of this, he was turned over to the Romans and executed like an insurrectionist. According to early creedal statements, a short period after Jesus died, his followers believed that he resurrected from the dead. The number 3 days is probably more theological than historical, given how the resurrection prophecies and narratives don't agree on the precise timing. For reasons we'll explore in the following episodes, his followers understood his resurrection as the beginning of the end times. That's about all we can glean from the creedal statements, but there's a pretty important detail one of them mentions that can be corroborated by the Gospels. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul mentions, "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I had in turn received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. After that he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, last of all, as to one untimely born, he also appeared to me." According to Paul, Jesus appeared to St. Peter, the 12 apostles, 500 brothers, James, all the apostles, and last of all, himself. In the next couple episodes, we're going to put all these people, as well as a few others, under a microscope. Let's start with someone St. Paul doesn't mention, though, but pretty much every other source does. Her absence from Paul's list is remarkable, though explainable: Mary Magdalene. So I know the whole 3 days thing is under dispute, but for all intents and purposes, let's say Jesus appeared to her on a Sunday morning. In Mark and Luke, she enters the tomb, but in Matthew and John, she does not. In both Matthew and John, though, Jesus does appear to Mary when she is outside the tomb. In Matthew, 1 angel sits in front of the tomb. In John, 2 angels in white sit inside the tomb. In Matthew, Mary experiences fear and joy. In John, she weeps. In Matt, the disciples worship at his feet, but in John, Jesus tells Mary not to cling to him. Why the focus on Matthew and John? Well, the two accounts barely share any words, and they differ in quite a few details. Now, as we covered in our segment on memory research, this does not imply Mary didn't see an empty tomb. On the contrary, given how little the two accounts share, it is more plausible that Mary did see an empty tomb, told this experience to several people, and we ended up with 2 very separate accounts of the same event. It's like starting a game of telephone with 2 groups of people. The details will get muddled, but the core of the story remains. There are other reasons to believe Mary did see an empty tomb. Matthew, unlike Luke, barely shows any interest in female characters, so if he did invent this story, it would be odd to attach it to a woman. Speaking of which, this argument has been repeated ad nauseum, but yes, there is good reason to believe that a woman's testimony was worth far less than a man's in those times. Not only this, but Mary appears first in lists of female followers of Jesus quite frequently. In the Gospels, this is quite important, as name order signifies importance, and there is zero reason why Mary Magdalene, a woman who was believed to be demonic at some point, would be considered first among the female disciples. The reasonable explanation is it must have been believed that she was the first to see him. Another reason to think Mary's testimony is historical is because Mark and John have rather similar phrasing from the angel. I already mentioned how some details slip between the Gospels, but early Christians probably would have valued some dialogue, such as coming from an angel, over others. Why doesn't Paul mention an appearance to Mary, though? Well, because she's a woman. And we know that some early Christian writers tried to downplay Mary's role in seeing the allegedly resurrected Christ. Heck, in her own gospel, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Peter disparages Mary's report of seeing Jesus first. And in the Gospel of Peter, it is not Mary Magdalene, but Peter who sees Jesus first. What can we conclude? Regardless of the details, almost everyone agrees that Mary Magdalene saw an empty tomb and then saw Jesus. So Jesus resurrected then, right? No, not necessarily. A woman seeing an empty tomb and then seeing a perhaps grief-fueled vision of her dead friend do not necessitate a resurrection. We will revisit that later, but for now, this concludes our expose on Mary. Let's move on to Peter, our next witness. This is one that St. Paul does mention. Paul separates Peter's experience from the rest of the apostles, implying he had a special, private encounter with Jesus. The question is, when was this? There's no gospel story that really fits the bill. This led some scholars to conclude that perhaps Peter, stricken from grief of not only losing his master but rejecting him 3 times, hallucinated him. The problem is this: why would a guilt-fueled vision compel Peter that Jesus had resurrected from the dead? This leads to a wider issue. There's a hefty amount of Jewish texts from 200 BC to 100 AD that mention an afterlife. None of them mention a resurrected Messiah, though. If Peter had seen a hallucination, he probably would have seen Jesus in heaven, not a resurrected Jesus, though. Here's where an even wider issue opens up that we'll speak to later in the series. Most historical Jesus scholars today agree that Jesus foretold his death and return. He did not, however, specify how he would return. So imagine you're a first-century Jew whose master was murdered in a humiliating fashion. How would you dream his comeback? Jews had a concept of a resurrection, but it wasn't supposed to be connected to a Messiah. Those were 2 distinct things. Furthermore, this epic liberation was supposed to be some militant second David who would usher in a new era of peace, dominance, and might. The resurrection, on the other hand, would come at the end of time, and it wouldn't be one man, it would be everybody. Instead of a Davidic king or an epic mass resurrection, Peter somehow saw a singular, humble Jesus who was not chilling in heaven but walking here on earth. This is a massive subversion of expectations that seems too weird to conjure up. It is more likely that Peter, perhaps after hearing about the empty tomb, did indeed see a vision of Jesus. What was the nature of this meeting? We don't really know. Though recall how I mentioned that the gospel writers moved things around to fit their narratives better? Well, Dr. Allison sees plenty of possible dialogues Jesus had with Peter that would make more sense in a post-Easter setting, such as when he gives Peter the proverbial keys to the kingdom. There is a story about the resurrected Jesus appearing to Peter while he was fishing in Galilee, but that story is only in John and has a lot of the evangelist's theology in it, so we're going to have to put that story in the uncertainty bin for now. Okay, next, St. Paul mentions Jesus appeared to the 12. This is another great example of numerology. Obviously, at the time, Judas was kinda absent, so there would have only been 11 of them, but that number 12 still holds a lot of theological weight. Okay, so the accounts of the 11, not 12, seeing Jesus vary between the sources, though they actually do have remarkable similarities in their basic plot structure. What sources do we have? Matthew, pseudo-Mark, which is like an extension of Mark added by somebody else later, Luke, and John. In each of these accounts, there's an establishment of setting, an appearance, doubt of the appearance, a commission, and the promise of Jesus' eternal support. Each account uses very similar words. They pretty much all use the following words: 11, see, believe, name, all the nations, all the world, Father, and Jesus spoke. This is where the similarities come to an end, though. So what can we say about the appearance to the 11, not 12? Well, it happened. That's about it, though. What about doubting Thomas? Paul doesn't mention this. In fact, only John mentions this, and it reeks of a theological treatise. Look, as I mentioned in the appearance to the 11 section, each account of Jesus' appearances had a story about someone or some group of people doubting. The Thomas story is so neat, tidy, and caked with theological language, much like the rest of his gospel, so it's more than likely that John came up with this story as a representation of all the doubters out there. Why choose poor Tom, though? Not sure. So perhaps there is a kernel of truth to this, but without any other source to verify it, it would be irresponsible to label this story as credible without a doubt. Before we conclude things, there are a couple other post-resurrection sightings that are worth mentioning. Ignatius of Antioch, an early Christian theologian who died in the early to mid 2nd century, reports that there exists an account in which Jesus appeared to Peter and the others, saying, "Touch and see, for I am not a bodiless demon." And they touched and believed, being mingled with his flesh and spirit. And after his resurrection, he ate and drank with them as a being of flesh, although he was united in spirit to the Father. Who did this mysterious account originate with? The earliest church fathers were just as clueless as you and I. Here's the even weirder part. Though the passage reads very closely to Luke chapter 24, Ignatius doesn't ever show knowledge of the Gospel of Luke at all. He most likely didn't even know it existed. This led church fathers Origen and Jerome, who came around a little bit later, to believe that Ignatius was citing a non-Lucan source. If this is true, it is significant, but without more evidence, we can't say much more here. What about the road to Emmaus, in which Jesus appears to 2 disciples who don't recognize him as he walks with them? They then tell Jesus, who they don't recognize, all about this Jesus guy and don't realize it's him until he gets to their destination with them and breaks bread with them, and it's oh so romantic and perfect, a little too perfect. The story is caked with Lucan language. That said, there are scholars who believe there's an element of historicity buried deep beneath all the theological layers, but there's nowhere near enough data to extract such a historical happening, so we're going to have to abstain from saying this one happened for certain. We're getting to the bottom of the barrel, guys, and we're not finding much. Are we missing something, though? For Pete's sake, I can't remember it, but that'll have to wait for next episode. Until then, God bless you.